Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Crypt13, and in this video, I wanted to go in depth about enemy res, or enemy resistance. Understanding enemy res is not required, but it will definitely help you out in determining which way is best to take on certain enemies. And understanding how res works will help you better understand how res debuffing works. So this is quite an interesting topic, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first things first, don't get res confused with defense. These are two different attributes, and we're going to be going over resistance. So for the most part, enemies have 10% res to all of the elements or physical damage. Some enemies have an additional 40% elemental res corresponding to their element. And then some enemies have extra physical damage res like Modifiers and the Ruin type enemies. So let's do a rundown real quick of the res percent for every enemy type in the game. Then we'll see how effective various res percent debuffs will work on all of these enemies. So this table might look a little bit intimidating when we first look at it, but it's actually really quite simple. Basically, every enemy has about 10% res to every element, so we can just use this as our baseline. And then certain enemies have some exceptions. So those are the things that we have to remember. So rule of thumb is that most enemies will have 10% res to the elements, and then specific enemies will have a little bit extra res to certain things. So let's go over those certain things. So first off is the Modifiers. The Modifiers get 30% extra physical res. Samaturals get 50% extra elemental res corresponding to their element. The lava churls, so that means the stone ones and the frost ones, and presumably any other elemental ones that are going to come in the future, will have 70% res to their element and then 50% physical res. So for the geos, they have 70% geo res, and then for the frost arm ones, they have 70% cryo res. Ruin guards have 70% physical res, and ruin hunters have 50%. The whopper flower is a little bit weird because they get 10% res only after they're stunned. So when they're not stunned, they actually have a little bit more res. So this is an exception you have to remember. So typically when they're not stunned, they're gonna get 35% res to all of the elements, and then 75% res to their corresponding element. So just remember that. And then when they're stunned, they get 50% res to their element. So when it comes to the human type enemies like Fatui skirmishers and the mages and the treasure hoarders, they also have 10% res, but they also have minus 20 physical res. Then the pyro agents and the electro-sitchin mages, they will have a 50% res to their corresponding element. The pyro agent gets pyro resistance and the electro mage gets electro resistance. And then next is the Geo Vishap hatchling. He also gets extra res to geo and to physical. 50 for geo, 30 to physical. And then when it comes to abyss mages, they just have 10% res across the board, just like the slimes and the regular hilly churls. You know, that's the table in a nutshell. There's only a couple exceptions that we have to remember, but for the most part, they're going to have just 10% res to the elements. Try to commit that to memory, and this will definitely help you out in determining how you want to take out certain enemies, especially when it comes to abyss floors. Okay, the next thing to understand is to know your sources for how you get your res percent debuffs and how enemies get res percent buffs. So let's go over this list real quick. It's actually not that long, so yeah, we can just go through it real quickly. Enemies will get extra res percent buffs from elemental nodes. Elemental nodes are the nodes that appear sometimes in certain domains and on certain abyss floors. And in the 1.3 Dragon Spine update, there is an elemental node that sometimes spawns with the enemies. So these elemental nodes are going to give 50% res to all types of damage and an additional 50% res to the node's element. For example, in Dragon Spine, it's going to give an extra 50% cryo res. And then of course there is an extra bonus depending on the node's element. And right now there's 3 of them. So cryo gives double defense, electro gives double energy recharge rate for like the mages and the Fatui skirmishers, and pyro gives your enemies extra damage dealt to you. But those effects aren't important for this video. The important thing to know is that these nodes are going to give 50% res to all damage and an additional 50% res to the node's element. Next, the sources for res percent debuffs are going to be Superconduct, Chongyun Passive Talent 2, Xiangling C1, Jean C4, Venti C2 and C6, Animo Traveler C6, Beidou C6, the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece set, and Zhongli's new buff to his E skill. So those are basically the only sources of res percent debuffs that I know of, but if I'm missing anything, please let me know in the comments. So yeah. And so now that we know about all of this, we can get into some of the more juicy things. We're gonna start looking into calculations. And before we get into the calculations, there is a nitty-gritty low-level thing that you should know about how enemy res is calculated. So this important thing is that if the enemy res percent goes below 0%, then the effect of the debuffs get halved after that. And then the other thing to know is that the formula to calculate res is also changed depending on how much res percent they actually have. So when their res is below 0%, the formula changes. When it's between 0 and 75%, it's different. And then when it's greater than 75%, it's also different. So there's 3 different formulas for calculating enemy res percent. And we're gonna go over that once we get into our calculations. So with that said, let's finally get into our calculations. So let's go through a practical example. I will explain how the res debuffing math works when we superconduct a Ruin Guard. So superconduct will give us a 40% res debuff to physical damage. The math is going to look like this. Ruin Guards have 70% res to physical damage, so we take 70% and subtract 40% from it, giving us 30%. We then take a look at the res formula table, and since it's between 0% and 75%, the res formula is 1 minus res, or 1 minus 0.3, giving us 0.7. We plug that into our damage formula and we can get the total damage. So I chose this example because I wanted to highlight something very important. The effectiveness of the Superconduct is better on a Ruin Guard than it is to say on a Hilly Churl or a Treasure Hoarder. So what I mean by this is that the increase in damage that you get for superconducting a Ruin Guard is going to be better than when you superconduct a Treasure Hoarder. You will still deal more damage to Treasure Hoarders and Hilly Churls, but it's the increase in damage that's better. Our physical attacks are pretty much doing double the damage on a Ruin Guard now. And so here is an example of that. So against a non-superconducted Ruin Guard, we're doing about 680 crit damage, and then about 300 non-crit damage. And then once we apply our Superconduct, you can see that we're doing 2,100 damage now, but that of course is the bonus from our Thunder Soother set, and then without the Thunder Soother set, we are doing 1,500 crits and 700 non-crits. And this is going to apply pretty similarly if an enemy has a high affinity towards a certain element. Now let's calculate it again, but with a Hilly Churl. So Hilly Churls have a 10% res to physical damage, so we subtract 40% from 10% and we get negative 0.3. Since this is below 0, the formula is going to be 1 minus the res divided by 2. So remember how I said that your res debuff is halved if you debuff an enemy past 0% res? So this formula is taking that into account. So if we use this, the formula becomes 1 minus negative 0.3 divided by 2, and the final result that we get is 1.15. We multiply this directly into our damage formula and we can get some nice extra damage. And you can see from the background footage that our normal hits are dealing about 2,000 crit damage and 900 non-crit damage, and then once superconducted, our crits deal about 2,600 damage. So that's a less than 50% damage increase versus the double damage increase we saw with the Ruin Guard. So clearly the increase in damage is not as much, but we are still dealing more damage at the end of the day. So hopefully now enemy resistance now makes much more sense to you, and if you've stuck with me for this long, then I thank you very much. And before you leave, if you learned something or if you liked my video, then don't forget to hit that like button and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Alright, until next time, see ya.